She didn't make a reservation.
Good Lord. There we go. Okay, we're ready. Sorry. Troubleshooting technology again. How's everybody doing? Good. So for those of you that were here last week, apologies, this is a little bit of a repeat, but I just want to kind of go back and reestablish. So the topic of conversation for the next X number of weeks, not entirely sure yet, I'll have a better idea once we kind of get into it and I see how fast we move through it, is the context of the Gospels. And we are going to look at the individual Gospels. Thank you for getting the Bibles out. I should probably grab one. We're going to look at the individual Gospels. But what we're doing especially is trying to look at the Gospels from the specific context that they were written in, okay? So we've got four Gospels, right? One of them isn't like the others. That's John. And then we've got the three Synoptics. And what we talked about last week is the span of time in which they were written. So we've got Mark being the earliest gospel. We have Matthew and Luke. Mark the earliest, written sometime between 60 and 70 Common Era, AD, for those of us who were raised in the 80s and 90s and before that. When did it switch from AD to Common Era? When did it stop being Anno Domini and it became...
I think right around 2000.
Yeah, it was after I was out of school, yeah. Mark, sometime between 60 and 70 AD, Common Era. Matthew and Luke, sometime between 80 and 95, 80 and 100, question mark, Common Era. And then John, again, being which one of these things is not like the other, as late as Kathy, thank you.
Jesse,
thank you,
so
Kathy.
welcome.
On your birthday, too.
I know. Where's my cake?
John being potentially written as late as 2nd century, 110 Common Era, could be as early as 90, but kind of, when I was in seminary, they skewed John towards later, 110, and there are reasons behind this. So, right off the bat, one of the things that is important and interesting to think about is how did the time in which the gospel was written influence not only the content, but the nature of what was written. And again, this is going to be a little bit of rehashing from last week, but I think it's kind of, especially the first couple of weeks of a new thing, I think it's important to kind of like really firmly establish this groundwork. And this might be weird thinking for you. I know it was for me. I talked about this last week as well, too. I don't remember when I matured in my thinking away from kind of like my Sunday school understanding the Bible to what eventually became, my seminary education. And one of the markers of that for me was understanding that I didn't have to have anxiety around the different accounts of the Gospels, right? Because that was always something that I struggled with as a young person. It's like, well, why do we need 4 Gospels? Why isn't there one true account of the story of Jesus? And I don't know when that kind of became a thing. When I became okay with the idea that, okay, these are 4 different perspectives in the same narrative. And of course, that makes complete sense if you think about, a family event and the 4 or potentially 100 different views of what happened in that event, right? The story I always tell with my brother is the time that we were throwing raspberries at the ceiling fan, right? You've all heard that one before, or has it been a long time?
It's been a long time.
Okay, so my grandfather had a whole host of raspberry bushes, so we had a glut of tomatoes and raspberries. That was I desperately miss that resource. We have had not so much luck with our raspberry bushes, mainly because of dogs. That's a whole other story. But one of the side effects of that was that we had so many raspberries that we would just freeze tubs and tubs of raspberries that go in our chest freezer, which was great for my brother and I because that was like our dessert. That was our treat, right? If we wanted something sweet to snack on, we'd go get a tub of frozen raspberries and eat them frozen, right? We wouldn't even thaw them out. We'd just pop them out. Great, tasty summer treat. We were doing so, and I don't remember what day of the week it was. We were in our living room, which had a vaulted ceiling with a ceiling fan at the top. We were playing the whole toss raspberries up in the air, catch them in our mouth thing, which again, already on the floor. Come on, kids, you know.
How old were you?
What's that?
How old were you?
Old enough to know better. And that evolved because what happened was we were, tossing them higher and higher, and that one of them got tossed up so high it hit the ceiling fan, and promptly, just like physics would predict, was ejected into the wall on the far end of the house. Which the other piece about this was there was a large supporting beam that spanned the wall, so it hit the white wall and dropped on top of this beam and stayed there. And then that was like amazing because then it became a game. Could we repeat this? So what we finally did, being smart young people, is we went up the staircase to my parents' loft bedroom where the ceiling fan was at eye level and we were throwing them like this. And that was the scene that my mother walked into, was blood spatter against the white wall. Anyways.
So who went and got the ladder to clean it up?
Oh, we did, yeah. That took a lot of scrubbing, let me tell you. And it did, and there was always a patch there until Mom painted it back over. But it was funny because I was telling Sean this story. I was like, I don't remember how the conversation arose, but I was saying, oh yeah, I tell this story all the time. And he's like, that's not the way it happened. And of course, we have debates over who initiated this, right? Who was at fault? And I will tell you that 99% of the time it was Sean, but I got blamed for it.
Yeah. Of course you did.
So this just goes to shows that, and I'm sure you have these stories too, right? Rod, Sharon's pointing at Rod, of a memory, good, bad, whatever. But when the family gets together and they share that memory, there's conflict because of details and how those details are remembered. Now, again, imagine this in the context, the earliest account of the story of Jesus that we have that still exists is the Gospel of Mark, and it's 30 years, at least 30 years after the events occurred. Okay, and one of the things that we talked about last week is that doesn't seem like a long time for us, but we have been raised in an era, in like a 5th-century era of printed word, right, with relatively cheap information delivery resources, right, paper and pen and printing and all of these things. For, well, not the last 500 years, but especially the last 100 years have been relatively easily accessible. Now, in the era of the digital, it's so much easier, right? I mean, you guys are all laughing at me like you're so young, I know. But it's even mind-blowing to me. I remember, my grandparents gifted us our Apple IIe computer, which had all of 256 megs of storage, not RAM, right? And now, a typical file is 256 megs. It's hard. You guys are like, I don't know. You're spouting off nonsense, Jesse. But I can fit, right, on a thumb drive, this big, like 1,000 times the storage that sat on the entirety of the computer that I had in 1989 or whatever. Okay? So, like, just understand the absolute information bias that we have, okay? To hopefully understand why we have what we have in our, let me get the Bible, in this. And really how kind of miraculous it is that we do have what we have, okay? And in a lot of ways, one of the beautiful things is it's actually really neat that we have 4 existing perspectives on the story of Jesus. I think we would be worse off if we only had one. If we only had one surviving gospel, right? How do we know that was actually, even somewhat accurate? When scholars do scholarly work, the first thing that they're looking for is corroborating documents, right? Documents that will support or challenge, a premise or an idea. And by the way, this is one of the things that is hard with doing biblical scholarship, is that this is a bit of a white rabbit. I don't know if that's the right metaphor that I want. But this is a unique thing, right? There are not a lot of documents that can support this. And this isn't a critique against the Bible at all. It's just not much exists from that era. Most of the documents that we do have, by the way, this book is hilarious. This is an old one, the New Testament background, supporting documents. Pretty much everything we have from the time of the Gospels are Roman records. That's it. We have a historian, Josephus, who I talked about last week, that wrote extensively about that timeline. But nobody was writing about anything, because you didn't. The documents that were worth keeping were tax records and censuses and things that were important to the empire. And, by the way, stories about the emperors, right? When we talk about Revelation, we'll talk about how the myth of the emperor, right, comes into conflict with the myth of Jesus. But that's a whole other story. Okay, so Mark's gospel is the one that we're going to start with. Mark, as I said, written sometime between 60 and 70. And again, we don't, unfortunately, whoever wrote Mark didn't put a copyright date on it, right? That wasn't existing in that timeline. And we don't have a cover-to-cover copy of Mark that is complete, or of any of the Gospels for that matter. We have stuff that is like maybe 85% complete, right? But a lot of what we have are fragments. And so a lot of what modern biblical scholarship, and not just modern, but biblical scholarship for the past 1,500 years has been, is corroborating and collecting all of these fragments that we might come to better versions of this, right? So do you understand, therefore, why we have hundreds of translations of the Bible? Because they're not all even based off of the same set of documents, right? Every consecutive version of the New Revised Standard Version, maybe there's a new fragment that they finally were able to translate that challenges a word, right? And it was probably something really not important, but that's what scholarship mostly is. It's doing a bunch of boring stuff that nobody will ever appreciate or understand. Okay, so 60 to 70 Common Era. What's going on in that time period? War. Which is pretty much, to be fair, every time period in the history of the Roman Empire, there's a war somewhere, okay? And that, by the way, is something really interesting to think about. And I don't know that we often take our minds down that pathway, is that this book places the Jewish story front and center. In the importance of the universe. But in the grand scheme of things, in the narrative of the Roman Empire, this is minor stuff. I mean, in terms of what was important to Nero or Caligula or Tiberius or any of these people that we point to as being great persecutors of the Christians, it wasn't really a big deal to them. It was a minor uprising that was a little bit of a pain in the butt, right? The Jews, we've talked about this before, the Jews were a little bit more than a minor pain in the butt to the Roman Empire for a couple of reasons. They had a tendency to revolt, which was not, by the way, something that the Roman Empire was necessarily used to, because they were so firm in their responses to revolts, which you can see in the narrative that we'll talk about in a little bit, which also will be a little bit of a rehash from last week. But they had a tendency to revolt. And when we think about the impetus behind that, a lot of it has to do with what makes modern day Israel, which is this firm belief that Israel as a people are the chosen people of God, and it's only through these people, only through this work, that the world can be redeemed, okay? right? And so you can understand, therefore, why these people might not assimilate into the Roman Empire so well, which is, it's an interesting thing about even kind of like bringing that narrative forward into a modern context of, talking about conquered peoples assimilating into their conquerors. Why did we struggle in Afghanistan? Why did we struggle in Vietnam? Well, why did the Romans struggle in Israel? Another piece of it was just the nature of Judaism, which they made awful Roman soldiers. They refused to do anything on Friday evenings and Saturdays, which if you're part of the Legion, just doesn't work, right? We're marching 10 miles today. No, we're not. It's Sabbath. No, I can't eat that. What do you mean? It's a Roman rations. What do you mean you can't eat that? No, it's unclean, right? So they made awful soldiers, which as a result were never conscripted into Roman military forces. And so Israel itself had this kind of unique position in the Roman Empire, which we know about because that's in our gospel narrative as well, which is you had a Roman governor, which at the time of Jesus' crucifixion was Pontius Pilate, presiding over this region, which was actually governed by three different Jewish leaders, the sons of Herod, right? That existed for a very brief amount of time, and then they all get deposed eventually, and then kind of sort of assimilated into the Roman Empire, which in turn then causes the events that occur during the 7th decade of the 1st century Common Era, which is the First Roman-Jewish War. Okay, we did talk about that last week, but I want to dig into that. So let's talk about Roman emperors first and foremost. Who are the ones that you know? Caligula. Everybody knows Caligula. Caligula. Tongue twister. He was such a weirdo. No, I mean, yeah, he was straight up strange. He was born in 37. Oh, sorry, 12. But his reign started in 37. So roughly 4 or 5 years after Jesus' death. He's only an emperor for about 4 years, right? Which is really interesting that we are most knowledgeable of the emperors that served the shortest reigns. It's the guys that were in position for 20 or 30 years that we really don't know about. Claudius, right? He was Caligula's successor, right? He was emperor for 13 years. He served up until he didn't serve. Emperors don't serve; they rule. I have to change my language. He ruled up until his death in 54, probably poisoned by his wife, in favor of her son, Nero, everybody's favorite persecutor of Christians. The emperor that supposedly burned Christians for torches in his backyard patio parties. Nero reigns for a remarkably long time, considering how completely nuts he was. Nero reigns, and this is important, from 54 to 68. Okay, 68 places us smack dab in the middle of the time period where we suspect Mark as the gospel is written. Okay, so right off the bat, imagine that the author of the Gospel of Mark, or authors, right, could have been a collective work, are operating during a time period of a completely nuts emperor. Imagine the chaos. Imagine just kind of like what that might look like living in the Roman Empire during that time period, right? Not a stable reign to exist under. Much less if you're a Christian. Okay, now, again, really important piece of context here. I'm not going to project on you. I always imagined that when we talked about Nero persecuting Christians, that there was this really, that Christianity was already its own thing. Like, Nero was pulling people out of Milwaukie Lutheran Church and marching them. Okay, no. Christianity at that point in time, and really through the end of the 1st century, is a Jewish movement. Okay, Nero wasn't just persecuting Christians. Nero was persecuting Jews, and especially Jews who identified as Christians. Nero was persecuting anybody that was a thorn in his side. So anybody that's talking revolution, that's talking revolt, that's making his life more difficult, although he wasn't really acutely involved in the managing of the empire at that point, it was still his mom. They got the rough treatment, right? So Nero reigns over the empire up until June 9th, 68, commits suicide because basically he was such a jerk that his own guard abandoned him, and then he was tried by the Senate, sentenced to death, but he killed himself before he could be executed like a common criminal. Okay. Then we get the year of the 4 emperors. So things were so crazy at the end of Nero's reign that we literally have 4 emperors just in the year of 68 to 69. Okay. So Galba takes over in June 8, 68. He lasts all of 6 months. He makes it until 15th of January 69 when he's murdered by the Praetorian Guard. There's a coup. Okay. Then Otho takes over that same day. He was a member of the coup, no surprise there, led against Galba. He lasts all of 4 months. He makes it until the 16th of April. He commits suicide after losing a really important battle to a guy named Vitellius, who then takes over as emperor. Vitellius then reigns from 19 April to 20th December 69, when he is then murdered by a guy named Vespasian. Well, not by Vespasian specifically, but by Vespasian's troops. And then Vespasian reigns from 69 through 79, 10 years. Okay, so we return to a rather normal, quote unquote, emperorship or whatever it's called. And he lives long enough to die of natural causes. Okay. Who's Vespasian and why is he important? Vespasian is the emperor that turns the focus. So we've had all of this conflict inter-Roman conflict, emperors, people killing emperors to take their place for the past year, but really the past 4 or 5 years, ever since things started to go to pot with Nero. Vespasian is the guy that steps in and says, you know who we should really be fighting against? The Jews. So Vespasian, and this is me, you're reading this through Jesse's lens, by the way. This may or may not be cohesive with most historians, but this is the way that I've always looked at it. So Vespasian turns all of this animosity that exists solely onto these Jewish revolutionaries, these Jewish rebels, and then thus commences the Jewish-Roman War. Now, he did not start the war. This was something that had been going on, and one of the reasons that the Jews in particular were upset was that they saw a decreasing identity of leadership, being Israeli Jewish leadership, and increasing, it was becoming more of a Roman state. Rome was trying to put the thumb screws on, trying to tighten things up. Just so happens that Vespasian, steps in after these years of turmoil, and he says, "I'm gonna, make this. I'm gonna pave this road. I'm gonna smooth things up." Now, the event that most of us maybe know from the First Roman-Jewish War is battle. It's not really a battle at Masada. Okay, does everybody know what Masada is? And again, if you were here last week, I'm repeating myself, but it's worth it. So Masada is kind of the event that ends this big thing. There had been actually several battles, some of which were actually won by the Jewish forces, these Jewish revolutionary forces. But what finally kind of begins the downfall is that there's this big battle. Vespasian brings 2 or 3 legions down, and Josephus, our historian, leads a Jewish army out to meet them, and there isn't even really a battle. They're so badly outnumbered that the Jewish forces flee. Josephus is arrested and kind of turns coat a little bit maybe. And then Vespasian marches his legion south. The remainder of the Jewish forces end up holding up in Masada, this stone fortress on top of this mountain, hilltop, mesa, okay, that is almost impossible to get up to, right? There's one single solitary, narrow path that leads up the side of this promontory up to the fortress, which is held by something like 100 600. I don't remember. I'll look it up later. It's a relatively small force of people, and they last for quite a long time, significantly long considering the disparity in forces. But the reason is the Romans simply can't get up there to do anything, and the Jews had stockpiled resources up there. They were prepared to last this siege out, and I don't know what they expected to come out of it. Problem is it's so hard to get up there, it's also impossible to get out. So they knew that there was no retreat. And so this is also one of my favorite pieces of Roman history, is that, a testament to Roman stubbornness. They are A-okay waiting them out. And so what they finally do is they literally pave a road up to the top of Masada. They're like, well, we're not going to capture this place by marching soldiers single file the whole time being harried by, arrow fire or slingshots or whatever. We're just going to pave a road up there so we can march legion up and end this. Well, the Jewish revolutionaries see the writing on the wall and then proceed to commit suicide en masse. That's Masada. So this is the political, military, and cultural context that Mark's gospel is written in. Any questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Were there only the two forces, Jewish and the Romans? Weren't there any other?
No. So it was uniquely a Jewish revolt. And again, it seems crazy that they could even kind of like get things rolling, considering the disparity. But this has always been. And I am not an expert in Roman history at all. I will put that right up front. I am an amateur in reading it. But one of the things that has always, and eventually affects the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is the need for expansion. And so the focus of the Roman Empire is always on their borders, right? They don't have a large garrison in Jerusalem or Tiberias or Caesarea Philippi or anything like that. They just don't have large standing armies. Number one, because they don't need them, right? But number two is because it's expensive to maintain soldiers. And where they are focused on, what keeps the Roman Empire afloat, is the constant conquest of new lands, bringing in new wealth, bringing in slaves, goods, etc. That keeps things going. And it's finally what, again, this is arguable, but what finally results in the fall of the Western Roman Empire some 300 years later is that they expand too far, infrastructure collapses, they're forced to pull back, but by that time it's too late. And then there's economic collapse and all kinds of stuff, right? So no, right? The Jews are able to effect a rather remarkable revolt, primarily because there wasn't much arrayed against them. But as will happen eventually, is this is what Vespasian does. Is then he says, okay, here is a rebellion I can crush to get public opinion on my side, and it works. He reigns for 10 years. Susan.
Where was Masada?
Masada is southeast of Jerusalem. So it's on the way to the Dead Sea. Well, I can't really show you a map. And what is that? For some reason, our firewall is being stupid today. It won't let me pull up Google Maps. Well, okay, whatever. And I mentioned I wasn't able to go there because the roads washed out. It was raining. Yeah. Were you able to go there? Yeah. So Helen, what was Masada like? Did you get it?
Well, for one thing, I don't like a tram.
Yeah.
So I shut my eyes. And John videoed till we got, because neither one of us were able to walk.
So it's like a cable car that takes you up there? Yeah.
Like a ski.
Yeah, a ski lift.
But you can walk up it too.
Yeah.
Neither one of us had the knees to do that.
Was there like an exhibit? Did they have information?
Well, of course there were tours that we took, but it was natural.
Yeah.
I mean, it was what was there.
And so there are, obviously it's 2022. There are plenty of aerial views that you can see of Masada. It's striking, and it's really, it appears that everything's cut out of the stone of the mountain up there.
What was amazing was the aqueducts that got water there.
So how did they feed?
I have no idea.
But this was something that was remarkable too, because this was one of the reasons that they could hold out was they had a water supply that the Romans couldn't cut off. You know. Paula, you were going to say something.
Wasn't it Herod's summer palace or something like
Yes, yeah. So Masada was originally constructed during Herod the Great's Great Works program. So he constructed Masada and Caesarea by the Sea, were his two major public works projects that he did. You know, it's kind of an economic impetus thing, believe it or not. But then of course this is yet another case where then Herod didn't pay his labor and you know, and Caesarea by the Sea it's defunct. It didn't last super long. Never became a settled port.
And what is Masada close to?
Nothing. But the Dead Sea, yeah.
Oh,
But,
okay.
yeah, so again, Israel in general is extremely arid, with the exception of the northern part of Israel, the Sea of Galilee, you know, and its surrounding very farmable areas. But the land around Jerusalem and as you go southeast towards Jordan, it's pretty dry. There's not a lot out there.
And yet they fight over it all the time.
Not that area. They fight over the Jordan Valley, Jordan River Valley, because that's also farmable. They fight over Galilee. I mean, Israel has a military base. So the Golan Heights, right? You've heard of the Golan Heights. It's where, you know, a lot of Israel's military power is centered because it's protecting access to the Sea of Galilee. They've got artillery emplacements up there to shell Lebanon if they need to. It's an intense area. Okay. So one of the questions that I asked last week, and I want to continue it forward before we move on to a couple of other things, is, you know, do we see evidence of this conflict in Mark? Okay, so do we see this flavor filtering into it? And the answer is not really, believe it or not. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Mark, as I've talked about a lot, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself, Mark is pretty much bare bones narrative. Okay, Mark and John are at opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay, John, we get a lot of elaboration, a lot of editorial commentary, just like in today's. That is probably my least favorite of John's commentary, is that one at the end, you know, where, you know, Jesus says, you know, to Peter, you know, one day you're going to be led around by your belt, etc. And John interjects this. He said this to indicate by which kind of death he was going to die. Like, no, Peter's hung upside down on the cross. I don't know what you're talking about, John. I don't know, just funny stuff.
So do you think the time frame between Mark and John's rendition might have something to do with a little midrash?
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when we get to John, well, this is an interesting thing to talk about and contextualizing Mark as well too. In Mark, it's Christians are Jewish people following Jesus, 100%. Okay, they still understand themselves to be Jews. This is right at the beginning of Paul, right? Paul has not yet completed his journeys everywhere, bringing Christianity to the Gentiles, right? That's not to say that there aren't quote unquote Gentile Christians at this point. But it's still a Jewish movement. And how we know this is when we read letters like Galatians and Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we see this huge conflict over whether you can be Christian without being Jewish, right? That's the big conflict in Galatians, right? Is there a way that we can be Christian and not have to go through circumcision? You know, because that was a big thing for that expression. But Mark, they're all Jews that are following Jesus. By John, it's done a 180. By the time we get to the Gospel of John, early 2nd century Common Era, Christianity has become a thing unto itself. Okay, it has we'd say broken away from Judaism, but more than that, it's just that because of Paul's travels abroad, Christianity's critical mass is now no longer in Israel. It's in Galatia and Philippi and Corinth and all these other what they would refer to as Gentile places, right? So yeah, good question. So no, okay. So we don't see evidence of this conflict in Mark per se. However, and this is an important thing to talk about, is we talk about corroborating evidence. So why do we date Mark to this time period? Okay. Well, there's a couple of reasons. Okay, one is, well, I'm going to stop saying I'm repeating myself because then I'm just doubly repeating myself. One is that Matthew and Luke use Mark as source material. Okay, so I brought one with me today so you can see what it looks like. No, I didn't. Shoot, I put the wrong book in my bag. Come on. I brought a concordance. I didn't bring my parallel. Darn it. Okay, well, never mind. I'm not going to show you. Okay, but next week. I was stuffing bags in my backpack hurriedly this morning because I was running late. So Mark is source material for Matthew and Luke. So last week we talked about percentages. So Matthew and Luke each have about a third of their gospel that is unique to Matthew and unique to Luke. And then about 40% of both Matthew and Luke is Markan material. So it's literally Mark that they have copy-pasted into their gospel. And then, well, 40%. Then another 20 to 30%, it varies between Matthew and Luke, is what we refer to as the Q source, okay? So imagine this, okay? The early era, so sometime between Jesus' death and the writing of Mark, you have potentially two separate narratives in distribution. Not necessarily conflicting, just two separate narratives of the story of Jesus. One becomes Mark. The other is this, it's not mythical, but this proposed Q source, okay, which is a gospel narrative that we don't have in existence anymore, okay? It's simply, no copies of it survived. Were there actually that many copies of it in circulation? Were there even any written copies, or was it a purely oral narrative, oral tradition that was part of the Christian movement during that time? We don't know, okay? But what we do know is that it existed, and the reason we know that it existed is because Matthew has his stuff, Luke has his stuff, both have some Mark in them, and then they both have the same exact material that makes up, varying amounts of Matthew and Luke. And so how did they get this stuff? Well, it had to be from another source. So here's really kind of the neat part to think about is that if you can imagine who was writing Matthew and Luke, okay, they are writing their narrative having source material in front of them, right? They are writing their narrative having a copy of Mark and a copy of Q, and they're using that as their basis, right? So this is important, especially when we get to talking about Matthew and Luke, but it's also important for when we're talking about Mark, because what this says about Mark is it says that Mark was a trusted and used narrative, okay? And this is really the most important thing to understand about any gospel, and I'm not just talking about the four that we've got here. One of the questions that I get asked commonly is, well, what about the Gospel of Peter, or what about the Gospel of Thomas? Why do we not read those in church? And this has fueled plenty of conspiracy theories. Dan Brown made millions off of this, right? I'm so angry that I didn't come up with this idea first, but he's 20, 30 years older than me, so get a jump start. Why don't we use the Gospel of Thomas? The answer is because the Christians didn't. So pretty much all of the apocryphal Gospels, the Gospels that are outside of the canon, they share a couple of things in common. Okay, one, and probably the most important, is that all of them post-date the four Gospels that we have. So most folks would say that Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Peter, I don't have exact dates on this. You can look this up on your own. Were written sometime at least towards the end of 2nd century, probably more likely early 3rd century, so 200s common era, okay? Why were they written? That's a good question, right? Maybe, well, probably, especially with the Gospel of Thomas, one of the things that's going on during early Christianity is you've got several veins of Christianity that emerge, right? One of the things that always drives me nuts is people like, oh, everything went wrong after the Protestant Reformation. That's when all the splits happened. I'm like, nah, these things existed from the beginning. From the beginning, people had different ideas over who Jesus was and what Jesus meant and all that stuff, right? And we see this manifest as early as the beginning. In Romans, in Galatians, in Paul's letter, right? You've got Paul saying, I am not, this is not the gospel of Paul, this is not the gospel of Apollos, or the gospel of Peter, or the gospel of whatever, this is the gospel of Jesus. One of the things that we know is that there was conflict over who was the authority about Jesus during this time, and you had them popping up in different churches all over the place as well, too. Okay? That was a squirrel that I followed somewhere. So why don't we use them? Okay, so number one, they were written pretty late. Number two, and probably the most importantly, is that nobody used them. Okay, by the time we even arrive at it's not the Council of Nicaea. That's not where the Council of Trent. Nah. Anyways, late 4th century. By the time we get the official recognition of this canon, okay, all the stuff that ends up in here was the stuff that had been used for 400 years. Okay, it wasn't like they had, the Old Testament and all these books sitting in front of them, and all of the bishops got together and voted on them. No. This already was a cohesive thing. All they did was rubber stamp it. Said, "Yep, that's the Bible now." Which, that's a whole other conversation. But one of the fun things to think about then is this is the point at which doctrine becomes an officially church-sponsored idea, right? That there is an accepted orthodoxy, right? Because before this, you could argue that there was a lot more malleability in what was Christian thought. By the time Constantine, founds the state church, that's when doctrine, orthodoxy becomes a thing. Okay, I'm getting way off topic. Yes.
If Mark was written first, why is it second in the New Testament?
That's a really good question. Here's the reason, and it has to wait. Matthew bridges to the Old Testament. That's it. So Matthew begins with the genealogy. Okay, Malachi, last book in the Old Testament, ends with the genealogy. So it's literally considered to be a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There is no order to the narrative. Right? You could make an argument, right, that it should be in chronological, and since Mark is a source material for the other one. But again, this order was, as far back as the Vulgate, right? Matthew was first, and it was purely for narrative continuity. That's funny. Every time that question comes up, that's the answer, is because Matthew bridges to the end of the Old Testament. But why then do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in that order? That's an interesting question. It's probably arbitrary, honestly. Yeah, who knows? Great question, Susan. So that's why we don't use the apocryphals, because they weren't being used. So all this coming back to say, Mark was used, right? Mark was a narrative that would have been common for the early church. And so let's do some imagineering here. Let's do some imagination, okay? What does the worshiping community that used the Gospel of Mark, what does that look like? Any thoughts about that? And let me throw out there, this is not a test, okay? This is not, I let you give out a bunch of answers and I tell you the correct answer. Because there is no correct answer, is we don't really know. We don't really have a good picture of what these early worshiping communities look like. The things that we do know is we know what their practices were. We know what some of their documents were. But in terms of were there pews? Well, there probably weren't pews because they're mostly house churches. But in terms of did it resemble what we do today? Yeah, maybe somewhat. What do you think?
I think it goes back to one of the things is what you said today about food.
Yes.
They gathered for a meal. It was communal, and it was food for, they got in trouble later because they weren't sharing their food.
Yeah.
But, that it was around community.
So, and this has been true, the earliest Christian communities, they were all Eucharistically centered, okay? 15 thoughts, I need to center on one. This is remarkable, okay? This has always been one of the most powerful things for me. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that I'm so insistent on weekly Eucharist when possible. Also why I argue in favor of lay presidents, but that's a whole other conversation as well too, is that the early church centered their gathering around a meal. Okay, every church was gathering around a meal. One of the early misconceptions and one of the early slanders against Christianity was around confusion over the language that they used to describe the meal, right? So they used similar language to what we use, which is partaking of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So, we talked about this before, the Romans often, when they were running a smear campaign against the Christians, they were accusing them of cannibalism. There were rumors going around that they were baking babies into loaves of bread, really great propaganda, right? Really great rhetoric. But the meal was front and center, okay? Which creates complications, by the way, right? Which is a fun thing to explore as well, too, is as Christianity moves from Mark to Matthew and Luke to John, we have Christianity that is no longer centered in Judaism. So we've got a Christianity that is, in many places, a mix of Jewish communities and Gentile communities, but very different meal practices, right? So these questions of purity, right, and cleanliness come into effect. And they weren't intellectual arguments. This is one of the things that I think we miss out on as well too, is when we read the epistles and we've got Paul addressing whether or not you need it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols, or whether or not the Gentiles need to follow the Jewish meal practices. It wasn't just because they were arguing over what's the right thing. It's because when they sat down for a meal, they had to figure out what was okay for everybody to eat. The early Christian church had to deal with food issues the same way as we do. Gluten-free, vegetarian, food allergies. They had to deal with the exact same thing. 2,000 years of this, right? Every time somebody cries, well, do we have to have gluten-free options? I'm like, we're lucky that's the only thing we have to deal with, right? Can you imagine sitting between a community that has been brought up on this fact that you cannot mix these things? You can't mix milk and cheese, or you can't mix meat and milk. You can't have shellfish. You can't have all these things. And then you've got a Gentile society which thrives on the fruit of the sea, right? Like, what do you mean you can't eat shrimp? Are you psycho? Have you had shrimp etouffee? It's delicious. You're missing out, man. Sorry, I'm way too punchy. So, the early church absolutely had food fights. They had issues that they had to deal with. So food was central. What do you think? What were they doing in worship, right? In Mark, in the church of Mark. Now remember, it's mostly Jewish. So when were they meeting? Were they meeting on the Sabbath? And when was the Sabbath, right? Our Sabbath at one point becomes Sunday. Were they meeting on Saturday mornings? Yeah, most likely. Their church was happening when everybody else was doing church. And they were probably reading from the Hebrew Bible, right? They were reading from the Hebrew Bible, and then perhaps they were reading miracle stories about Jesus, because that was what was being circulated the most. Mark is really a collection of miracles, okay? This is front and center what makes up the majority of Mark's narrative. And these stories of healing, of casting out demons, of feeding people miraculously, these are the things that people remembered and collected and eventually turned into a narrative. So perhaps these early communities, that's what they were doing, is they were gathered around, sharing a meal, reading from the Bible, which was the Hebrew Bible, and then they maybe read a healing, a miracle story about Jesus. Right? I think it's really, really, really important for us to kind of imagine what this looked like, because then when we read a gospel like Mark, we're in some way reading it through that lens. We're understanding how people that actually created this narrative would have understood this narrative function. And for me, this gives greater value to this, because these stories were so important to these people, right, that they stored them, they curated them, they collected them, they held on to them, even despite the risk to their well-being, right? Even despite the fact that should they potentially be found out as Christians, Nero's going to turn them into human torches. Again, I've already established it's a little bit hyperbolic, right? It was more complicated. But as time progresses, we get towards the latter end of the first century into the reign of Domitian. Things get remarkably more persecutory. That's not an adjective. But yeah, things get worse for the Christians, especially as Christianity begins to merge out of Judaism. Okay, last thing, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, one of the remarkable things. That's a pun. Remarkable. One of the remarkable things about Mark. Oh man, what's the etymology of remarkable? Okay. One of the remarkable things about Mark is the nature of how they string their narrative together, which is that Mark uses the word immediately all the time. Okay, something like 49 or 51 times. It's this, and I forgot that I should have written the word down. You use it, but whatever. It's Greek. You'll trust me on that. He uses the same word immediately. And this is how he strings together all of these different healing and miracle narratives, is that this is happening, and then immediately this happens, and then immediately this happens, and then immediately this happens. Question: why? Why is that the way in which he strings together this narrative? Because in reality, and I'm sure that most of the people reading this were aware of, time passes between these occurrences. Why is Mark's stepbrother? There's a Monty Python joke in there somewhere. Why is Mark so insistent on using this word immediately? What do you think? Again, no wrong answers here. This is not a test.
Does it have a slightly different meaning back then?
I mean, with all translation issues, okay, when we talk about the meaning of a word, it's all of the above. It's complex because anything, right? We have this word in Greek. We pick a word in English that seems to be a corollary to that word in Greek. We lose out on some meaning of that word inevitably. It happens with any language, right? Even modern languages, translating from French to English or German to English. Like you want to talk. This is why there are Bonhoeffer scholars that are still employed, is because people are still arguing over what Bonhoeffer meant in High German when he wrote his Ethics or whatever. They're arguing that he used this word, but what he actually meant by it was this. Not what it's been translated as. So to answer your question, Paula, we read it as immediately. Perhaps there was a more nuanced translation.
Well, it makes it more vivid and exciting.
Yeah.
Action.
Okay. And you've landed on something here, which is really, really important as well too. So we talked at the beginning about how 30 years isn't a long time, but was a long time. How much do we struggle with contextualizing these stories from 2,000 years ago, making them relevant in our context, right?
I'm not sure how much we would be able to interpret something that happened to us 30 years ago.
Yeah,
2000.
that's the truth. It was a different era, technologically and politically.
Meaning.
Yeah. So yeah, we struggle nowadays to make things quote unquote relevant, right? That was the hot button word in churches 15 years ago. How do we make it relevant? I imagine that the people that are gathered around these stories struggle with the same thing, right? Did this happen 30 years ago? And Jesus was supposed to come back, haven't seen him, don't know where he's at, right? The kingdom was supposed to have manifested by this point in time. Where is the redemption of all creation? Could speed that up, expedite it, next day shipping for Amazon maybe. So one of the things that I think Mark is probably trying to do is make things relevant, make things exciting for the community that's reading them, and immediately. And one of the things that many scholars will often point to is that his use of that word is lending a sense of anxiety to it, right? Not in a negative aspect, but in like, this is extremely important stuff. And immediately, Jesus healed this person, and immediately they went here, and immediately that happened. Like, this isn't stuff that we can sit in our hands about, harkening back to the sermon. This is stuff that's important to us right now, and we need to be excited about it. We need to be doing something about it. Because, again, and this really covers Christianity up through the end of the first century, is that the prevailing pressure was the risk of exposure the risk of recognition, the risk of persecution, which waxed and waned according to who. There were periods, even in the first century, where you could be a Christian and nobody thought twice about it, right? Well, that's not true. You weren't going to get killed for it. You might be looked down upon by your peers, but it was seen as an eccentricity, okay? And then there were periods of that, even the first century, where you didn't let anybody know who you were or what you were up to because that meant you'd be a human torch. Okay? So one of the things I think Mark is trying to impress upon his people is that, like, we need to be acting now. We need to be doing these things that Jesus told us to do, despite the risks that might be involved.
I was thinking the Romans are coming.
Yeah, better get it done quick because the Romans are going to get us tomorrow. Yeah, Joe.
Is there a possibility as well that he's trying to carry forward the sensation of good storytelling?
Absolutely.
Like, this guy comes up and he says, there's this miracle, and then the next guy, right after that, there was this miracle.
Absolutely.
Keep that sense
Oh,
of
okay.
morality.
And you have brought up a really important thing that we struggle with a lot in reading this is that, and again, this goes back to the beginning where I was talking about, when was the age when I was okay understanding 4 different gospel perspectives, okay? This is not history, okay? It is, but it's also literature, okay? Right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing different accounts, and they are putting different spins on them. That's not a good word to use, okay? This isn't, we're not talking about different news networks here. They are telling the story that, and again, here's a really important thing to understand, is that if you're part of a Christian community during this era, you know this story, okay? You know this story for the most part. There's also a really big interest in telling the story, right? During an era where you don't have a printing press, how do you spread the story of Jesus, okay? You can't do it through pamphlets, you do it through people, okay? That's really important to understand, okay? Mark is also trying to tell a story that's interesting, right? Because you have a vested interest in people reading or listening to and hearing this narrative and being compelled by it, which might be why Mark continuously uses the word immediately. He doesn't want his listeners he doesn't want it to be a boring sermon. And here's the last thing I'll say, and then we'll close for the day. This is the other piece that we really need to shift our thinking on. We treat this all as written word. 95% of the people that are hearing the gospel are hearing it, not reading it. Okay, literacy rates, especially in this time of the world, not extremely high. And whether or not people are able to read, you don't have enough printed. There is no printed. You don't have enough written copies of this, right? The way that most people digested even the Hebrew Bible was by hearing it read, right? Jesus stands up in the synagogue, reads from the scroll of Isaiah. There's a reason that, our tradition, which we take for granted now, which is we have somebody who's a reader every Sunday. And I imagine all of us at some point have thought, I can read this on my own, and I can read it a lot faster than whoever is up there doing it, right? But where that has its roots in is it has its roots in the era of which the only way to hear the story was to hear the story. You weren't going to get a printed copy of Mark. You were going to hear it read to you. Mark wants his story to be interesting. He wants people to be able to hear it, which I think is also one of the reasons that Mark isn't extremely lengthy in his writing, right? He wants you to hear this miracle story and this miracle story and this miracle story and stay interested.
And because of the tendency of making long stories and people then not remembering the whole thing, keeping it short and simple and to the point.
Yep. Stick to the facts, man.
Doing sound bites.
Doing sound bites. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Yeah. Trying to keep it interesting, trying to keep it palatable. And by the way, this is, I'm doing too many one more things. The epistles is this way as well too, right? So Paul writes all these letters. It's a miracle that we have as many copies of them as we do, because the way that those letters were shared was the same thing. Somebody would read from them to the community, right? They weren't making a bunch of copies and handing them out to everybody in the church on Sunday morning. Okay. Okay, so for next week, we're gonna continue in Mark. I think we'll do Mark one more week, and then we'll move to Matthew. Trying to pull a Mark, trying to stay up on it. But what we're gonna do now next week is I'm gonna pick out like three stories that we're gonna look at and try to read through these different lenses. Sound good? Great.
I have a request.
Yes.
Is there any way you can telecast next week?
This is telecast.